The wind in the Kansas Territory of 1872 had a language all its own. It wasn't the gentle whisper of eastern breezes that rustled through leafy maples. It was a coarse, grating tongue that spoke of grit and distance and endings. It scraped across the plains, kicking up a fine red dust that coated everything, a constant reminder that the land was king, and it was a harsh and unforgiving ruler. At the heart of its dominion lay the Crossroads, a place where two dirt tracks, rutted and weary from the passage of countless wagons, intersected in a simple, brutal cross. One track led east, back toward the settled towns with their church spires and whispers of civilization. The other pushed west, a vein leading to the fevered heart of the gold country, a place that promised fortune but usually delivered a shallow grave. This was where Mary Louise Carter sat for 7 nights. This desolate intersection had been her home. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of earth, marked by a gnarled, leafless old cottonwood that looked more like a skeletal hand clawing at the sky. She huddled at its base, her late husband's woolen coat wrapped tight around her, a flimsy shield against the ceaseless wind. At 22, she possessed a beauty that was as raw and untamed as the land itself. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. But now, that beauty was hollowed out by grief and gnawed by hunger. Dust was settled in the lines around her eyes and in the tangles of her dark auburn hair, which had escaped its pins and whipped around her face like angry spirits. 7 days, 7 nights. The number had a biblical ring to it, a weight of trial and creation that felt like a mockery. On the first day, she had been fueled by a desperate, frantic hope. On the third, that hope had curdled into a stubborn resolve. By the 5th, despair had begun to eat at her edges. Now, on the 7th night, all that remained was a dull, aching emptiness, a void where even feeling had become a luxury. Her husband, Jacob, had been a good man, a kind man with big, calloused hands and a laugh that could make the rafters of their small cabin ring. He saw the goldfields not as a place of greed, but of promise, a chance to build something that was truly theirs. He died for that promise, caught between a shipment of ore and a band of opportunistic road agents. He wasn't a gunslinger, just a man with a shovel and a dream. The news had come back to the small settlement of Promise Creek like a stray bullet, finding her and shattering her world. But the town's sympathy was a shallow creek that dried up fast. Jacob's partner, a shifty-eyed man named Silas, claimed Jacob had been reckless, that he'd provoked the fight. Whispers started. The Carters had always been unlucky. Jacob's father had died of fever. His mule had gone lame. And now Jacob himself, gone. The whispers turned to accusations, spoken in hushed tones behind cupped hands in the general store. Mary Louise Carter was bad luck, a black widow in the making. The women, their faces pinched with a grim, self-righteous piety, crossed the street to avoid her. The men either looked through her or at her with a new, predatory gleam in their eyes. A widow was property without a proprietor. She was given 3 days to vacate the company-owned cabin. She had nowhere to go, no family to speak of, save for a distant cousin in Ohio she hadn't heard from in a decade. So she had walked. She had walked to the Crossroads, the very place Jacob had set off from, with some vague, unformed notion that she was waiting for a sign, or a wagon, or perhaps just waiting for the end. The folks from Promise Creek who passed by in their buckboards would slow down just long enough to stare. The children would point. "Look, Ma, it's the mad woman of the Crossroads." The name had stuck. It was easier to call her mad than to acknowledge the cruel hand that fate and their own cold shoulders had dealt her. As the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange, the cold began to bite in earnest. It seeped through the wool of her coat, a deep, invasive chill that settled in her bones. Her stomach was a tight, painful knot. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, save for a few wild berries that had puckered her mouth. She closed her eyes, trying to summon Jacob's face, but even his memory was growing thin, like a photograph left too long in the sun. A sound broke the monotony of the wind's howl. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic creak of a merchant's wagon. It was the boisterous, ragged sound of drunken laughter and the clumsy thud of horses being ridden too hard. Her eyes snapped open. Her heart, a slow, tired drum, suddenly began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. 3 riders emerged from the gloom of the western road, silhouetted against the dying light. Cowboys, probably paid out from a cattle drive and now full of cheap whiskey and mean intentions. They pulled up short when they saw her, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. "Well, looky here, boys," the leader slurred. "A big man with a florid face and a stained duster." He swung himself clumsily from his saddle. "If it ain't the little lost dove of Promise Creek." His 2 companions chortled, their laughter sharp and ugly. They dismounted too, forming a loose, menacing semicircle around her. The smell of stale liquor and unwashed bodies rolled off them, fouling the clean, cold air. Mary Louise scrambled to her feet, pressing her back against the rough bark of the cottonwood. Her mind raced. There was nowhere to run. The plain stretched out in every direction, a vast, empty stage for whatever horror was about to unfold. "Leave me be," she said, her voice a reedy whisper, almost stolen by the wind. The leader took a step closer, his eyes roaming over her with a crude, possessive appraisal. "Now, that ain't neighborly. A pretty thing like you, all alone out here. You must be lonely." "I'm waiting for someone," she lied, the words tasting like ash. She tried to inject a note of warning into her voice, a hint of a husband or brother just over the rise. The man just laughed, a wet, guttural sound. "Waiting for someone, honey. Looks to me like your waitin's over. We're here." He lunged, and she sidestepped, the rough bark scraping her back. Her breath came in ragged gasps. This was it. This was the end Jacob's death had only postponed. She would die here, under this skeletal tree, torn apart by grinning jackals. One of the others, a lanky youth with vacant eyes, grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her head back. A cry of pain and terror was ripped from her throat. The leader moved in, his foul breath hot on her cheek. "Let's see if you bring us some bad luck, little widow," he sneered. And then another sound cut through the tense, terrible tableau. A new sound. It was crisp, steady, and methodical. The crunch of heavy wheels on the hard-packed dirt road, the rhythmic clopping of draft horses, and the faint, melodic jingle of a harness. The cowboys froze. They turned their heads toward the eastern road. A wagon was approaching. It wasn't a farmer's buckboard or a fancy carriage. It was a heavy freight wagon, the kind used for long hauls, its canvas cover pulled taut over a high, bowed frame. A single lantern hung from the driver's seat, casting a small, lonely circle of gold in the deepening twilight. The man holding Mary Louise's hair loosened his grip slightly. Distracted, the leader squinted into the gloom, annoyance twisting his face. Just some damn peddler. Get rid of him. But the wagon didn't slow. It moved with an unhurried, implacable purpose, rolling steadily toward them until the horses, 2 big, sturdy Belgians, came to a halt not 20 feet away. The driver sat impassively on the seat, a silhouette against the lantern's glow. He was a broad-shouldered man in a worn hat, its brim pulled low. "You have business with the lady." The driver's voice was low and calm, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, cutting through the wind and the drunken haze. It was not a question so much as a demand for an accounting. The cowboy leader puffed out his chest. Drunken bravado was a powerful fuel. "This ain't your concern. Friend, ride on." The driver didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply sat there, his stillness more unnerving than any threat. It becomes my concern when I hear a woman cry out. For a long moment, silence stretched, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the rustle of the wind. Mary Louise held her breath. The man holding her hair looked nervously from his leader to the silent figure on the wagon. The odds were still 3-1, but there was something about the driver, a coiled stillness, an aura of quiet competence that shifted the balance. The leader made his decision. "She ain't worth a bullet," he grumbled, spitting into the dust. He shot Mary Louise a look of pure venom. Another time, widow. He turned and swung himself back onto his horse. His two companions followed suit, scrambling into their saddles with a final, resentful glare. With a whoop and a spur, they galloped off into the darkness of the western road, their drunken shouts swallowed by the vast emptiness of the prairie. Mary Louise collapsed back against the tree, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her weak and shivering, not just from the cold, but from the raw, visceral terror of what had almost happened. She looked toward the wagon. The driver still hadn't moved. He was just a dark shape, watching her. She couldn't see his face, couldn't read his expression. For all she knew, he was a different kind of danger. The West was full of them. Slowly, deliberately, he wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down from the wagon seat. He moved with a fluid, economical grace, the walk of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and utterly aware of his surroundings. As he stepped into the light of his own lantern, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was about 30, perhaps a little older. His face was lean and weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. His eyes, in the flickering lantern light, were hard to read gray or blue. She couldn't tell, but they were steady and direct. He wasn't handsome in the way Jacob had been. With his open, smiling face, this man's features were sharper, carved from harder material. He wore practical, durable clothes, denim trousers, a flannel shirt, and a leather vest. A gun belt was slung low on his hips, the handle of a Colt Peacemaker worn smooth with use. He was, she realized, exactly the kind of man who traveled these roads alone and survived. Thomas Reed. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze taking in her disheveled state, the wild hair, the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, the way she trembled. He didn't offer pity, for which she was grateful. Pity was a soft, useless thing. "They gone for good?" she asked, her voice barely a croak. "For tonight," he answered, his voice a low baritone. "Whiskey courage doesn't last. They'll find a bottle or another victim before they think of you again." He looked around at the desolate crossroads, at the skeletal tree, at her, the lone, pathetic figure at its base. A flicker of something crossed his face, curiosity, perhaps, or simple confusion. "This is a poor place to spend the night," he stated. It was a simple fact, not an accusation. "I have no other," she replied, the truth of it landing with the weight of a stone. He stood there for another long moment, the silence stretching between them. Mary Louise felt a strange sense of unreality. This man and his wagon had appeared out of the twilight like an apparition, a grim answer to a prayer she hadn't even dared to voice. She braced herself for him to climb back onto his wagon and drive away, to leave her to the darkness and the ghosts of what might have been. He had done his good turn. He owed her nothing more. But he didn't move. His gaze was fixed on her. And in that gaze, she saw a man making a calculation, weighing risk against inconvenience, trouble against conscience. She was trouble. She was the madwoman of the crossroads, the unlucky widow. She was a burden no sane man would take on. He finally gave a slow sigh, the sound of a man resigning himself to a decision he'd already made. "There's an old homestead a few miles up the road, abandoned, but the roof is sound enough. I'm camped there for the night." He paused, then added, "It's better than this." It wasn't an invitation filled with warmth or charm. It was a practical, stark offer, as unadorned as the landscape around them. But to Mary Louise, who had been starved of kindness for so long, it was a lifeline. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump of emotion that had formed in her throat. He turned without another word and walked back to his wagon. He didn't offer her a hand up, just waited for her to climb onto the hard wooden seat beside him. She did so, her movements stiff and awkward. He settled in next to her, the space between them feeling both vast and intensely intimate. He unwrapped the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the big horses strained forward, and the wagon began to roll. Mary Louise didn't look back at the crossroads. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the broad, steady backs of the horses and the small, bobbing pool of light from the lantern cutting a path through the immense, waiting darkness. After 7 nights of waiting for her life to end, a stranger's wagon had stopped. It had stopped just for her. And for the first time in a very long time, she was moving, not running away, not wandering aimlessly, but moving towards something. She had no idea what it was, but it was better than the wind and the dust and the crushing, soul-deep loneliness of the crossroads. The wagon ride was a journey through a world of shadows and silence. Mary Louise sat ramrod straight on the hard plank seat, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, the knuckles white, the space between her and the man beside her. Thomas Reed felt charged, a no-man's land of unspoken questions and deep-seated fears. He didn't speak, his attention focused on the road ahead, his profile a rugged landscape carved by the lantern's glow. The only sounds were the steady plodding of the horses, the groan of the wagon's axles, and the ceaseless, lonely whisper of the wind across the plains. Every jolt of the wagon was a jolt to her frayed nerves. She was acutely aware of his presence, the quiet strength in the way he held the reins, the proximity of the holstered pistol on his hip. He was a stranger, a man with a gun who had appeared out of the darkness. He had saved her. Yes, but the West was a place where saviors and predators often wore the same face. Her mind, a traitorous thing, kept replaying the scene at the crossroads, the leering faces of the cowboys, the rough hand in her hair, the stench of whiskey. This man had driven them off. But what were his own intentions? Was this just a slower, more patient kind of trap? Fear was a cold, bitter bile in her throat. After Jacob, she had thought she would never trust a man's strength again. Jacob's strength had been in his hands, tools for building and planting, for holding her gently. But his strength hadn't been enough to save him. And the men in Promise Creek, their strength was in their sharp tongues and their cold, righteous judgments. The cowboys' strength was in their numbers and their cruelty. What was Thomas Reed's strength? It was quiet, contained, and utterly unreadable. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Yet, beneath the terror was a bedrock of grim reality. She had no other choice. To refuse his help would have been to choose a slow death by starvation and cold, or a quick, brutal one at the hands of the next pack of drifters to ride by. The crossroads had been a symbol of her paralysis, a place to wait for an end. But by climbing onto this wagon, she had made a choice, a blind, desperate leap into the unknown. She was no longer waiting. She was moving. And for now, the fear of the unknown was infinitesimally smaller than the certainty of the fate she had left behind. After what felt like an eternity, he pulled the horses to a stop. "We're here." The homestead was little more than a ghost against the star-dusted sky. A small cabin, a collapsed barn, and the skeletal remains of a fence that listed sadly in the dirt. It was a place of failed dreams, like so many others littering the plains. The wind moaned through the gaps in the barn siding, a mournful, lonesome sound. Thomas climbed down and, without a word, began to unhitch the horses. Mary Louise hesitated, then slowly, stiffly, climbed down herself. Her legs felt unsteady, as if they had forgotten how to hold her. She watched him work, his movements efficient and sure. He led the horses into the relative shelter of the ruined barn, murmuring to them in a low, soothing tone she hadn't heard him use with her. He returned a few minutes later, carrying the lantern and a canvas roll. "The cabin's this way." The door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing a single, square room. It was empty save for a stone hearth, a crude table, and a thick layer of dust, but it was 4 walls and a roof, a sanctuary from the relentless wind. Thomas set the lantern on the table, its light pushing the deep shadows into the corners. He knelt at the hearth, and with flint and steel and a handful of kindling he produced from his pack, he coaxed a small flame to life. As the fire grew, catching on the larger pieces of wood he'd evidently gathered earlier, it cast a warm, dancing light across his face. For the first time, she could see his eyes clearly. They were the color of slate, flecked with gray, and they held a deep, impenetrable weariness, the look of a man who had seen too much of the world and expected very little from it. He stood and turned to her. "There's coffee, and I have some jerky and hardtack." The mention of food made her stomach clench with a pain so sharp it took her breath away. She could only nod, afraid that if she tried to speak, she would either burst into tears or betray the desperate, animal hunger she felt. He seemed to understand. He didn't press her. He moved to his wagon, returning with a coffee pot, a tin of grounds, and a water skin. He set the pot on a hook over the growing fire, then unwrapped a parcel of dried meat and biscuits. Placing them on the dusty table, he did it all with a quiet focus, as if this was a ritual he had performed 1,000 times in 1,000 lonely places. He gestured to the food. "Help yourself." Mary Louise approached the table as if it were a wild animal. She picked up a piece of jerky, her hand trembling. It was tough and salty, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly at first, then with a ravenousness that shamed her. She didn't stop until she had devoured 3 pieces of jerky and 2 hard biscuits, washing them down with water from the canteen he'd silently placed beside her. She knew she was being watched, but couldn't bring herself to care. When she was finished, she looked up and met his gaze. He was sitting on a crate he'd pulled near the fire, sipping coffee from a tin mug, his expression unreadable as ever. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet observation. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "No need." The coffee began to bubble and hiss, filling the small cabin with its rich, comforting aroma. Thomas took the pot from the fire, poured a cup for himself, and then looked at her, his brows raised in a silent question. She nodded, and he poured a second cup, pushing it across the table toward her. She wrapped her cold hands around the hot tin, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. The coffee was black and bitter, but it was hot, and it felt like life itself. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle and spit of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The cabin, which had at first seemed like another cage, began to feel like a fortress, a tiny island of warmth and light in a vast, dark sea. Thomas was the first to break the silence. "Why were you out there?" he asked, his voice even, devoid of accusation. "At the Crossroads." Mary Louise stared into her cup. She had been asked this question 100 times in the accusatory glances of the people of Promise Creek, but from him, it sounded different. It was a simple, direct inquiry. "I was waiting," she said softly. "For who?" "I don't know. For anyone. My husband, he's gone. Died a month back. The town, they didn't want me there anymore." The words came out flat and emotionless, a recitation of facts that belonged to someone else's life. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't say he was sorry for her loss. He just listened, his slate-gray eyes fixed on her. His lack of conventional sentiment was, strangely, a comfort. It felt more honest. Pity was a currency she had come to despise. "So you sat at the Crossroads for 7 days?" She looked up, surprised he knew the number. Had he passed by before seeing her there? "Word travels," he said, seeming to read her mind. "Heard talk of the mad woman in the last settlement I passed through." So that's what he saw when he first looked at her. Not a woman in mourning, not a victim, but a mad woman. The thought stung, but she couldn't deny the truth of it. Perhaps she'd been a little mad. Grief and hunger could do that to a person. I had nowhere else to go, she whispered, looking back down at her hands. It was the last place I saw him alive. This, finally, seemed to land with him. A subtle shift occurred in his posture, a slight softening around his eyes. He looked from her to the fire and back again. He had intended this to be a simple act of charity, a single night's shelter for a woman in trouble. And then they would part ways in the morning. He was a man who traveled alone for a reason. Attachments were liabilities, dead weight on a man who had his own ghosts to outrun. He had his own destination, his own business, and neither involved a young widow with eyes full of sorrow. But as he looked at her now, huddled by the fire, her small frame swallowed by her late husband's coat, he saw more than just the madwoman from the rumors. He saw the terror that had been in her eyes when he'd first pulled up. A raw, hunted look that he recognized from other places, other wars. He saw the flicker of defiance that had kept her alive for 7 days in the wilderness. And he saw a profound, soul-deep loneliness that echoed something in his own chest, a hollow ache he had long since learned to ignore. Her gaze lifted and met his across the flickering firelight. It was a look stripped bare of all pretense. It held fear, yes, but also a sliver of gratitude, a desperate question, and a resilience that was as stubborn and stark as the land itself. And in that moment, something shifted inside Thomas Reed. The simple, detached desire to help a stranger for a night was complicated by a different, older instinct, the urge to protect. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. It was dangerous. It was a complication he didn't need. But it was there, undeniable, awakened by the silent plea in a young widow's stormy eyes. He cleared his throat and stood up, breaking the spell. "You should get some sleep." He walked to the corner of the cabin and unrolled his bedroll, a simple canvas and a pair of thick wool blankets. He placed it on the floor, a good 10 feet from the fire. Then he took one of the blankets and brought it to the table, setting it down in front of her. "Take this. The floor is hard, but it's better than the ground. Stay by the fire. It'll be the warmest spot." He turned and walked back to his own spot. Taking off only his vest and his hat, he lay down on the remaining blanket, his back to her, the gun belt still resting on his hip. It was a clear dismissal, a drawing of a line. He had offered her shelter, food, and a blanket. He had not offered conversation or comfort. He was a closed door. Mary Louise watched his still form for a long time. She took the blanket he had given her and spread it on the floor near the hearth, the stones still radiating a pleasant warmth. She lay down, pulling her husband's coat tighter around her. She didn't sleep. She was too aware of the man breathing softly in the darkness on the other side of the room. She thought of the Crossroads. It was a place of choosing, and she had chosen nothing. She had simply waited, abdicating her life to fate. But fate had shown up in the form of a freight wagon and a quiet, weary-eyed stranger. By climbing onto his wagon, she had unknowingly chosen a new path, turning from the one that led back to the bitter past. This path was dark and uncertain, and she was walking it with a man she didn't know, a man who was clearly running from something of his own. But it was a path. For the first time since Jacob's deaths, she was on a path, not just sitting at the intersection, waiting to be consumed by the dust. The thought didn't bring her peace, but it did quiet the frantic terror in her heart, replacing it with a fragile, tentative spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time, the will to see what lay around the next bend. The sun rose on the abandoned homestead with a brutal, indifferent clarity. Mary Louise awoke on her blanket by the hearth, stiff and cold, the fire having died to a bed of pale gray ash. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the Crossroads, the cowboys, and the silent man returned in a painful rush. The cabin was empty. A pang of pure panic seized her. Had he left her? She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the door. her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas was outside, tending to his horses. He moved with a practiced economy, checking their hooves, brushing their thick coats. He hadn't abandoned her. The relief was so profound it left her weak. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him, a silent, capable figure against the vast, empty canvas of the prairie. He had given her shelter, and he was still here. That was all. And for now, that had to be enough. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Thomas never said she should stay, but he never said she should leave either. He would rise before the sun, tend to his animals and his gear, and then disappear for hours, scouting the land or hunting. He was a man in constant, quiet motion, and Mary Louise. After the initial paralysis of her fear and grief began to subside, found she could not bear to be idle. Idleness invited ghosts. So she worked. The cabin was a shell, but she was determined to make it a shelter. She found an old broom in the corner of the collapsed barn and swept away years of dust and grime. She scrubbed the crude table until the pale grain of the wood showed through. She found a stream a quarter-mile away and hauled back water in an old bucket Thomas had, using it to wash the few possessions she had and the single set of clothes on her back, letting them dry in the relentless Kansas sun. She organized his sparse supplies, sacks of flour, beans, coffee, salt into a makeshift pantry on a set of stacked crates. These small acts of domesticity were an anchor in the chaotic sea of her new life. They were tasks that had a beginning and an end, a satisfying order that her world sorely lacked. She was no longer just waiting. She was building. One afternoon, Thomas returned from a hunt with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder. He watched her for a moment as she stirred a pot of bean soup over the fire. "The horses need to be exercised daily," he said, his tone flat and factual. "One of them is gentle enough. It's time you learned to ride properly." Mary Louise's stomach tightened. She had ridden before, perched behind Jacob on their old mule, but she had never been in control. The sheer size and power of Thomas's Belgians terrified her, but she saw the sense in his words. Out here, not being able to ride was like not being able to walk. It made you a prisoner. So she nodded, a tight, jerky motion. He chose the mare, a placid giant named Bess. Her back was as broad as a tabletop. Thomas showed her how to saddle and bridle the horse, his large, competent hands moving with a sureness that was mesmerizing. He didn't coddle her. He explained each step once, clearly and concisely, and expected her to remember. "Up you go," he said, holding the reins. Getting onto the horse was an ordeal. Her skirts tangled, and her muscles, weak from days of inactivity and poor nutrition, trembled with the effort. She felt clumsy and foolish, but Thomas simply waited, his face impassive. When she finally settled into the saddle, she felt impossibly high off the ground, a small, fragile thing perched on a mountain of living muscle. "Hold the reins, but don't fight her," he instructed. "She knows what to do. You just need to learn her language." He led her around the homestead in slow circles for the first hour, his hand never far from the bridle. Then he let go. The moment of separation, of being solely responsible for the powerful animal beneath her, was terrifying. But Bess was, as he'd said, a gentle soul. She plodded along, her gait steady and rhythmic, slowly, painstakingly. Mary Louise began to relax. She learned to move with the horse, to feel the shift of its muscles, to anticipate its steps. By the end of the day, she could guide Bess in a wobbly circle by herself. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time in months she had felt a sense of accomplishment, a flicker of control over her own destiny. A few days later came the second lesson. Thomas was cleaning his colt by the fire after their meager dinner. The lamplight gleamed on the oiled steel. The weapon was a constant, intimidating presence on his hip, a symbol of the violence that was an everyday fact of this land. "You need to know how to use this," he said, not looking at her. He held the pistol out to her, handle first. She flinched. The last time she'd been near a gun was when the town marshal had returned Jacob's things. The sight of it made her feel sick. I can't. His slate-gray eyes finally met hers. They were not unkind, but they were unyielding. Out here, there are no can'ts. There's what you do to survive, and there's what gets you killed. Jacob, your husband, could he shoot? The question was a physical blow. He was a miner, not a gunman. She whispered. And now he's dead, Thomas stated, the words falling like stones into the quiet cabin. It was brutal, but it was the truth. You almost were, too. If I hadn't come along, what would you have done? Wishing won't stop a man with bad intentions. A bullet will. Shame and anger warred within her. He was right. Her helplessness had almost been her undoing. With a trembling hand, she took the gun. It was shockingly heavy, a cold, dense weight of deadly purpose. The next day, he took her to a dry creek bed and set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. He showed her how to stand, how to hold the revolver with both hands to steady it, how to aim down the sight. His instructions were a quiet murmur behind her, and when he reached around her to adjust her grip, his arm brushed against her back. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the gun. It was the first time they had touched, and the warmth of it, the solid strength of him so close, was both terrifying and strangely comforting. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent roar that seemed to shake the very air. The kick of the gun was a brutal punch against her palms, and the bullet went wide, kicking up a cloud of dust a good 10 feet from the targets. She cried out, dropping the revolver as if it were a hot coal. Thomas said nothing. He simply picked it up, checked it, and handed it back to her. Again. She fired again and again. Her arms ached, her ears rang, and her shoulder felt bruised. But she kept on, fueled by a grim determination. And then, finally, a miracle. She pulled the trigger, and one of the tin cans flew off the log with a satisfying ping. She stared, breathless. She had done it. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Thomas's mouth. It was the first time she had seen anything resembling one on his face, and it transformed his harsh features for a fleeting second. "See," he said softly, "you can—" Their fragile peace was destined to be broken. Their supplies were running low, and a trip to Promise Creek was unavoidable. Mary Louise was filled with dread. The homestead had become her world, a safe, isolated bubble. To go back to the town, to face the whispers and the stares, felt like reopening a wound. Thomas seemed to sense her anxiety on the ride in. The wagon loaded with the pelts from his hunting. "Stay in the wagon if you like," he offered. But she shook her head. Hiding felt like a coward's choice. She was no longer the helpless woman at the crossroads. She could ride, she could shoot. She would not be intimidated by gossiping old women. She held her head high as they rolled down the town's single dusty street. The whispers started immediately. Faces appeared in windows. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. She could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear the words, "There she is, the unlucky widow. And look who she's with, that stranger. Living with him, they say, shameless." At the general store, the feeling was suffocating. The storekeeper's wife, a woman named Martha Gable with a face like a clenched fist, gave Mary Louise a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Well, Mary Louise," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I see you've found a new protector." She made the words sound filthy. Before Mary Louise could respond, Thomas stepped forward, placing a heavy sack of flour on the counter. He was taller than most men in the room, his presence filling the space. He didn't raise his voice or even look at Mrs. Gable. He simply addressed her husband. "We need flour, coffee, salt, and 10 boxes of .44 cartridges," he said, his voice a low rumble. The storekeeper scurried to fill the order, avoiding his wife's furious glare. The other customers in the store fell silent. Thomas's quiet authority, the way he stood, the gun on his hip, it was a shield. He didn't have to say a word in her defense. His actions spoke for him. "This woman is with me. Your words are meaningless." Mary Louise felt a confusing swirl of emotions. She was grateful for his protection, but also deeply ashamed that she needed it. And another, more troubling feeling began to surface. As she watched him, standing tall and resolute against the town's judgment, she felt a flicker of admiration, of pride. That was dangerously close to affection. The thought made her feel instantly, deeply guilty. She clutched the locket she wore around her neck, the one with a tiny portrait of Jacob inside. What was she doing? Jacob was barely cold in his grave, and here she was, feeling a forbidden warmth for the stranger who had taken her in. She felt like a sinner, a disloyal wife. Jacob had been her life, her future. This quiet, guarded man was just a circumstance, a temporary harbor in a storm. To feel anything more was a betrayal of the deepest kind. That night, the storm that had been brewing in her soul broke over the plains. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple. The wind rose to a furious shriek, rattling the cabin door and threatening to tear the very shingles from the roof. Then came the rain, not a gentle shower, but a torrential, driving downpour that hammered against the cabin like 1,000 angry fists. And then a new sound, a steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. A leak, a small one at first, near the far wall, then another, over the table. Within minutes, it seemed the whole roof was giving way. Water streamed down in a dozen places, turning the packed earth floor to mud. "Grab the supplies," Thomas yelled over the roar of the storm. They worked together in a frantic, desperate ballet, moving sacks of flour, tins, and blankets to the one relatively dry spot in the cabin, the small area directly in front of the hearth. It was a space barely big enough for 2 people. They were soaked to the skin, their hair plastered to their faces. When they had saved what they could, there was nothing left to do but wait out the storm. They huddled together by the fire, shivering, their shoulders almost touching. The rest of the cabin was a dark, wet mess, but their small circle of firelight was an island of warmth and safety. Thomas took one of their last dry blankets and, without a word, draped it over both their shoulders. The shared warmth was immediate, a profound comfort against the chilling damp. They sat there in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain beat a relentless tattoo on the roof. In the flickering light, Mary Louise looked at the man beside her. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on the flames, but in the set of his jaw, she saw not just hardness, but a deep, unyielding strength that had kept them both safe. The guilt was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but for the first time, it was overshadowed by another feeling, a simple, overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his head, his gray eyes questioning in the firelight. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He held her gaze for a long moment. The firelight danced in his eyes, and for a second, the weary, guarded walls he kept around himself seemed to lower. He gave a single, slow nod. He didn't say "you're welcome." He didn't say anything at all. But in that shared silence, with a storm raging around them and a single blanket warming them both, a new kind of fire was lit. It wasn't the passionate flame of a new love. Not yet. It was something quieter, more elemental. It was the first small, steady flame of connection. A spark of shared humanity struck between 2 lonely, wounded souls against the vast, howling darkness of the world. The days following the storm were different. The deluge had washed the air clean, leaving the prairie smelling of wet earth and wild sage. It had also washed away some of the formal distance between them. A shared crisis, however small, had forged a fragile bond. There was a new, quiet rhythm to their life in the dilapidated cabin. They spoke little, but their movements began to anticipate one another's. She knew he liked his coffee black and strong. He learned she hummed softly, almost unconsciously. When she was mending, a silent understanding grew in the space their words did not fill. Yet, as the physical distance between them shrank, Mary Louise became aware of a new, more profound gulf opening up. Thomas was changing. The calm, weary watchfulness she had come to know was being replaced by a sharp, nervous tension. He spent more time on the low rise behind the cabin, staring out at the vast, empty horizon, his hand never far from the butt of his Colt. He ate little and slept less. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear him shift restlessly on his bedroll, his breathing uneven, and once she heard a single, guttural word escape his lips in a troubled dream, Cole. The name meant nothing to her, but the sound of it, thick with something that sounded like regret and old anger, sent a chill down her spine. The sense of safety she had begun to build around herself, as fragile as a spider's web, started to tear at the edges. The man who had been her anchor was now a source of deep, unsettling mystery. He wasn't just a traveler resting on his journey. He was a man waiting for something, or a man running from something. Her unease crystallized into sharp-edged fear on a cool Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was out, having left at dawn with the cryptic statement, "Need to check the back trail." Mary Louise was doing her best to patch his spare shirt. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, and her needlework was clumsy. But it was an act of care she felt compelled to perform. She'd run out of thread, and after a fruitless search through her own meager belongings, she hesitantly turned to his. His possessions were few and utilitarian, stored in a canvas pack near his bedroll. There was nothing personal, nothing that spoke of a life beyond this nomadic existence. But tucked under his bedroll was something she hadn't paid much attention to before, a small, sturdy wooden chest bound with iron straps. It was old, the wood dark and scarred from years of travel. It was the only thing he owned that seemed to have a history, the only thing that felt truly private. A heavy-looking padlock secured it, a clear sign that its contents were not for public view. She knew she shouldn't. It was a violation of the unspoken trust between them, but the anxiety that had been gnawing at her for days, fueled by his strange behavior and the name he'd spoken in his sleep, was a powerful motivator. She had to know who this man was. She was living with him, dependent on him, and she knew nothing more than his name. As she knelt beside it, her hand hovering over the lock, she noticed something. The hasp was bent. The wood around it splintered, as if it had been pried open and hastily hammered shut again. The padlock, while in place, wasn't fully engaged. With a trembling finger, she pushed on it. It sprang open with a soft click. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it, a point of no return. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy lid. The chest didn't hold gold or secret documents. The first things she saw were mundane. A spare set of clothes, neatly folded, a whetstone for sharpening his knife, a leather-bound book whose pages were filled with dense, unreadable ledger entries. Beneath these, however, lay the relics of another life. There was a stack of faded letters tied with a piece of twine. The ink on them bled and faint. There was a small, tarnished silver locket, different from hers, which she did not dare to open, and tucked in the corner was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Her fingers felt numb as she unwrapped it. Inside was a single object, a sheriff's badge, a simple tin star, but with a deep, ugly gouge cut diagonally across its face, a deliberate act of defacement. Pinned to the cloth beside it was an insignia. It was a small, crudely forged piece of blackened silver, shaped like a hawk's skull, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare right through her. She had seen it before. A cold dread, far worse than anything she had felt at the Crossroads, washed over her. A year ago, a gang had swept through the territory, a plague of violence and fear. They were known for their brutality, for taking what they wanted and burning the rest. They had hit a bank 2 towns over, leaving 3 men dead, including the sheriff. The newspapers had been full of it for weeks. They called themselves the Maddox Marauders, and their symbol, pinned to their collars and branded on their horses, had been a hawk's skull. Her mind reeled, struggling to connect the 2 images, the quiet, protective man who had taught her how to shoot a tin can, and this symbol of cold-blooded murder. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She rummaged frantically through the chest, a desperate hope warring with a sickening certainty. Her fingers found a folded, yellowed piece of paper at the very bottom, a wanted poster. The sketch was rough, depicting a younger man with longer hair and a harder, crueler mouth. But the eyes were the same, unmistakable. Beneath the sketch, the words were stark and damning. $500, reward for information leading to the capture of Thomas Reed, wanted for bank robbery and murder, known associate of the Maddox Marauders. Led by Cole Maddox. Cole, the name from his nightmare. Mary Louise dropped the poster as if it had burned her. She stumbled back from the chest, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage, and the man she had begun to trust was its keeper, a monster hiding in plain sight. Every act of kindness he had shown her was instantly poisoned, recast in a sinister light. Had he saved her from those cowboys out of decency, or because he didn't like other predators encroaching on his territory when he taught her to shoot? Was he giving her a tool for survival, or was he training a potential accomplice? The shared warmth by the fire during the storm now felt like a spider's tactic, a way to lure her into a false sense of security. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself, but she couldn't stop shaking. She was a fool, a naive, trusting fool. She had run from the simple cruelty of a town's judgment and straight into the arms of a killer. The irony was a bitter, choking thing. The central question of her existence had once been how to survive her grief. Now, it was how to survive Thomas Reed. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of agonizing paralysis. Her first instinct was to run, to pack her few things and disappear back into the prairie. But where would she go? Back to the Crossroads? The thought was absurd. She was stronger now. Yes, but she was still one woman, alone. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would be able to track her. A man like that, a hunter, would find her in a day. Her only other option was to stay, to pretend she knew nothing, to watch and wait for an opportunity. The idea of sleeping under the same roof as him, of eating the food he provided, of looking him in the eye while knowing what he was, made her feel physically ill. When she heard the sound of his horse approaching at dusk, her body went rigid. She hastily repacked the chest, closed the lid, and slid it back under his bedroll. She tried to fix the lock, but her hands were trembling too badly. She shoved the wanted poster deep into the pocket of her dress, the crinkling of the paper a constant, damning reminder. She was sitting at the table, staring blankly at the cold stew in her bowl. When he walked in, he stopped just inside the door, his senses, honed by years of living on the edge, immediately detecting the change in the atmosphere. The air in the cabin was thick with a new, dangerous tension. He looked at her, his gray eyes narrowed, searching her face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. She could only stare at him, her mind a whirlwind of fear and betrayal. This was the man who had robbed a bank. This was the man who had ridden with a gang that left widows and orphans in their wake. How many men like her, Jacob, had he cut down? He took a slow step into the room, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, checking for threats, finding none. His eyes returned to her. Mary Louise. "Talk to me." The sound of her own name on his lips, a name he had spoken so rarely. was what finally broke her paralysis. With a hand that shook uncontrollably, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the crumpled wanted poster, and flattened it on the table between them. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than any silence they had shared before. Thomas didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. His eyes were fixed on the paper, on the face of the younger, harder man he used to be. The color drained from his face, leaving his weathered skin pale and taut over his sharp cheekbones. He had lived with this ghost for years, but he had never expected to see it laid bare on a dusty table in a forgotten cabin, presented to him by the one person who had started to make him feel like he could outrun it. He slowly lifted his gaze from the poster to her face. His expression was stripped of all its usual guards. What she saw there wasn't the cold-blooded killer she had imagined. It was something far more complex and painful. She saw shame. She saw a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. And she saw the bleak confirmation of a man whose worst fears had just come true. The past had finally caught up. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer excuses. He simply looked at her, the woman he had rescued, the woman he had started to care for in his own silent, guarded way. And he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "That was me." The single word was a confession and a condemnation. It shattered the fragile world they had built and left them standing in the ruins. He was everything she had feared, and her life was once again balanced on the edge of a knife. The question was no longer just whether a man could escape his past, but whether she could survive being a part of his present. The silence in the cabin after his confession was a living thing. It was heavier than the roof, thicker than the dust, and colder than the rain that had soaked them. For 2 days, they moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken truth of the wanted poster lying between them like a drawn gun. Mary Louise's fear had congealed into a hard, brittle shell of watchfulness. Thomas was a phantom of the man he had been, his face a mask of grim resignation, his movements slow and deliberate, as if a great weight had settled on his shoulders. The fragile intimacy they had found by the fire was gone, incinerated by the revelation of his past. On the morning of the 3rd day, Thomas broke the suffocating silence. He had the wagon hitched and ready, their few supplies loaded. Mary Louise watched from the doorway, her heart a cold knot of dread. This was it. He was leaving her, or worse, taking her somewhere to be rid of her. "Get your coat," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He wasn't looking at her, his attention fixed on the horizon. "Where are we going?" she asked, her own voice a thin whisper. He finally turned to face her. The weariness in his eyes was so profound it seemed to pull at the very fabric of his face. "Back to the beginning," he said. "You have a choice to make. It's only right you make it there." She understood immediately. The Crossroads. The journey was a silent torment. Mary Louise sat on the wagon seat, clutching her husband's coat around her, the crinkle of the wanted poster in her pocket a constant, tactile accusation. She studied the man beside her, the man she had allowed herself to depend on, searching for any sign of the killer from the poster. But all she saw was a man locked in a prison of his own making, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the reins so hard his knuckles were white. He was not a monster. He was something far more complicated, and that was infinitely more terrifying. When they arrived, the place was exactly as she remembered it, yet entirely different. The skeletal cottonwood tree still clawed at the vast, empty sky. The wind still scoured the dusty earth. But she was no longer the half-starved, hopeless creature who had waited there for an end. She was a woman who knew how to ride, how to fire a gun, and how to survive. And she was a woman who knew the man who had saved her was a wanted murderer. Thomas pulled the wagon to a halt in the very spot where he had first stopped for her. He set the brake, wrapped the reins, and then just sat there, staring at the intersection as if it were the geography of his own soul. "This is where I was headed," he said, his voice low, gesturing down the western road. "Running, always running." He then pointed east, the way he had come from. And that's where I was coming from. Nowhere in particular, just another town I couldn't stay in for long. He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and unflinching. I wasn't supposed to be here, not at this exact time. I wasn't looking for anyone to save. I was just trying to save myself. Mary Louise found her voice, sharp with the pain of her betrayal. So it was just chance fate. A bandit happens to ride by just as another bunch of them are accosting a woman. I don't believe in fate, he said, shaking his head slowly. Fate is what you call it after the fact, to make it sound like you didn't have a choice. I had a choice. I heard you scream. I could have spurred my horses and been gone. I could have pretended I didn't hear, didn't see. It would have been smarter, safer. It's what the old me, he glanced at her pocket, where the poster was hidden, would have done without a second thought. He took a deep breath, the confession costing him something vital. But I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired of running. Maybe I saw the same look in your eyes that I'd seen on too many other faces. The look of a world that has chewed you up and left you for the vultures. All I know is, I made a choice. I stopped this wagon. He turned to her fully then, his face etched with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. And now you have a choice. You know what I was. You know what I've done. You can get down from this wagon right now, and I'll give you all the food and water I have. I'll ride west and you can walk east. You'll make it back to Promise Creek, and you'll never see me again. You can go back to being the person you were before my shadow fell on you. His words hung in the air between them, a stark and terrible offer. She could be free of him, free of the danger, the fear, the complication of his past. She could erase the last few weeks of her life. But the thought of walking back to Promise Creek, back to the whispers and the scorn and the suffocating judgment, filled her with a new kind of dread. The woman who had left that town was not the same woman sitting on this wagon. Thomas Reed had changed her. He had armed her, not just with a gun, but with the strength to stand on her own. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What choice will you make?" "It doesn't matter," he said, looking away, back toward the western road that led to oblivion. "My path is set. The past doesn't let go. Mary Louise, Cole Maddox and his boys, they're not the kind to forgive a man for walking away. Sooner or later, they'll find me. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when." And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't offering her a choice to save herself from him. He was offering her a choice to save herself from the violence that was coming for him. He was trying to protect her, even now, from the darkness he knew he would draw to her. She thought of her 7 nights waiting here. She had been waiting for a sign, for deliverance, for anything. She had seen it as an act of faith, but now she saw it for what it was, an abdication of choice. She had been waiting for her fate to be decided for her. Thomas, for all his sins, had presented her with the one thing no one else had a true choice. "You're wrong," she said softly. He looked back at her, his brows furrowed in confusion. "You say you don't believe in fate," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "but you're acting like your own is already written. You talk about your past as if it's a cage you can't escape, but you did escape it. You chose to leave them. You chose to stop for me. Those were choices. The man on that poster, she touched her pocket, he would have kept riding. But you didn't. The man who stopped for me, that's the man who's sitting here right now." A flicker of something astonishment, hope, disbelief passed through his eyes. He seemed, for the first time, at a complete loss for words. She slid closer to him on the wagon seat, the space between them disappearing. "I spent 7 nights here, waiting for my life to be over. I had nothing. I was nothing. And then your wagon stopped. It stopped just for me. You taught me how to be strong. You stood up for me when an entire town turned its back. You shared your fire with me when the world was cold and wet. That wanted poster, that's paper, that's the past. It's not the man I see." She raised a trembling hand and touched his cheek. The stubble was rough against her palm. He flinched at the contact, as if unused to a gentle touch, but he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand like a starving man offered a crust of bread. All the fear, all the anger, all the betrayal she had felt, it all melted away in that single moment, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He was not a monster. He was a man, haunted and broken, who had made one right choice in a life full of wrong ones, and that choice had been her. He opened his eyes, and they were shining with an unshed emotion that stole her breath. He slowly leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was as quiet and momentous as a sunrise over the prairie. It was hesitant, gentle, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were chapped and tasted of coffee and the trail, and it was the sweetest, most sorrowful taste she had ever known. It was sweet because it was a promise, a sealing of the choice she had just made. It was sorrowful because it was a promise made in the shadow of a hangman's noose, a tender green shoot growing in the barren soil of their shared pain. It was a kiss that acknowledged the darkness of the past and the uncertainty of the future, but chose the present, this moment, this connection. Anyway, when they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, the world shrinking to the space between their breaths. "I cannot promise you a safe life, Mary Louise," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't promise you a white picket fence or the respect of your neighbors. The road ahead is dark, and I don't know where it ends." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his gaze burning with an intensity that held her fast. "But I promise you this. My past may be a shadow that follows us, but I will stand between you and it for as long as I can. They all left you. Your town, your friends, the world. I will not abandon you. Whatever comes, we face it together." Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back finally streamed down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of a fierce, defiant hope. The world had taken everything from her, and then it had sent her this broken, dangerous man. And she had chosen him. He had chosen her. He gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "So," he said, his voice still low, but with a new, lighter timbre to it. "What's your choice?" She looked around at the Crossroads, this place of endings and beginnings. She looked at the Eastern Road, the path back to a life that no longer fit her. Then she looked at the Western Road, the path into shadow and uncertainty, the path he had to travel. "My choice," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is to ride with you." A slow, genuine smile finally reached Thomas Reed's eyes. It was like watching the sun break through a week of storm clouds. He picked up the reins, and with a soft click, he turned the horses. But he didn't turn them east or west. He turned them north, onto a small, unmarked track that was little more than a whisper on the prairie, a new direction, a path of their own making. The journey north was a quiet rebirth, by choosing a new direction, a path unmarked on any map. They were choosing each other over the ghosts that haunted the Crossroads. They returned to the abandoned homestead not as a stranger and a stray, but as partners in a fragile, unspoken pact. The air in the cabin was different. The confession had not destroyed them. It had burned away the last of the pretense, leaving a foundation of stark, unvarnished truth. A dangerous truth, but one they had chosen to build on together. The days that followed were the most peaceful Mary Louise had known since before Jacob's death. They worked to make the homestead a home. Thomas, with his surprising skill for carpentry, repaired the leaking roof and reinforced the door. Mary Louise, discovering a small, overgrown patch of wild herbs behind the cabin, began a tiny garden. They spoke more, filling the evenings with stories not of his dark past, but of small, simple things. He told her about growing up in the forests of East Texas, of the sound of whippoorwills at dusk. She told him about her mother's quilting and the one time she had seen the ocean as a little girl. They were carefully mapping the safe territories of each other's souls, avoiding the dark, blasted lands of their shared trauma. The physical space between them had vanished. One evening, as a chill wind swept down from the north, he had simply laid his bedroll next to hers by the fire. There was no passion in the gesture, only a deep, human need for warmth and closeness. They slept side by side, not touching, but drawing comfort from the quiet sound of each other's breathing in the vast, lonely darkness. For the first time, Mary Louise felt the cold knot of fear in her stomach truly begin to dissolve. She was not just surviving anymore. She was starting to live. The peace was a beautiful, sunlit illusion, and it was shattered on a blistering hot afternoon. Mary Louise was outside, tending to her small garden, when she heard the horses. It wasn't the familiar, steady gait of Thomas's Belgians. This was the sound of multiple riders, moving with a swaggering, confident cadence that set every nerve in her body on high alert. She straightened up, shading her eyes against the glare of the sun, and saw them cresting the low rise to the south. 5 riders, dark figures shimmering in the heat haze. Her blood ran cold. Thomas emerged from the barn, a piece of harness leather in his hand. He had heard them too. He took one look at the approaching riders, and his face became a mask of stone. Every ounce of the peace and softness that had entered his life drained away, replaced by the hard, watchful stillness of the man she had first met. "Go inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Bar the door. Stay away from the window." "Thomas, who are they?" she asked, though she already knew. The name he had spoken in his sleep echoed in her mind. Cole. "Do as I say. Mary Louise, now." She ran inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slid the heavy wooden bar he had recently installed across the door, the sound of it locking into place seeming pitifully inadequate. She peeked through a small crack in the wall, her hands trembling. The 5 riders pulled up in a cloud of dust, forming a loose semicircle in front of the cabin. They were a hard-looking bunch, their faces burned by the sun and etched with cruelty. But her eyes were drawn to the man in the center. He sat on a magnificent black stallion, his saddle trimmed with silver. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed dark beard and eyes that glittered with a cold, intelligent amusement. He wore a fine black coat despite the heat, and pinned to his collar was a small, blackened silver pin shaped like a hawk's skull. Cole Maddox. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly. He surveyed the homestead, the repaired roof, the tidy yard, her pathetic little garden with a look of mocking curiosity. "Well, well, Tommy," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a smooth, almost cultured voice, which made it all the more menacing. "I have to say, I'm disappointed. I pictured you in a rat-infested saloon in Mexico, or maybe at the end of a rope, not playing house in a mud-caked hovel." Thomas stood his ground in front of the barn, about 20 yards from them. He hadn't drawn his gun, but his hand rested casually on the butt of it. "What do you want?" Cole Maddox smiled, a flash of white teeth in his dark beard. It was not a pleasant sight. "What do I want? I want my best man back. The business has suffered without your particular talents. You always had a steadier hand and a cooler head than the rest of these knuckle-draggers." He gestured dismissively at the men behind him, who shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "I'm done with that life," Thomas said, his voice flat and hard. "Are you—" Cole took a few steps closer, his amusement hardening into something sharper. "You can't just walk away. Tommy, you know that. You took an oath. You carry our brand. Or have you forgotten what you are?" "I know exactly what I am," Thomas said, "and I'm not one of you, not anymore." Cole's eyes flickered toward the cabin, a glint of cruel understanding dawning in them. "Ah, I see. It's a woman. It's always a woman that makes a strong man weak." He raised his voice, pitching it so she would be sure to hear. "Come on out, little lady. Let's have a look at the prize that cost me my best strategist." Mary Louise pressed herself against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. He was talking about her. This terrifying, confident man was mocking her, reducing her to an object, a prize. "Leave her out of this," Thomas warned, his voice dropping to a deadly low growl. "Your business is with me." "Oh, but she's the most interesting part of the business now," Cole purred, walking slowly toward the cabin door. "You see, you owe me. You left a job unfinished. You cost us a significant amount of money. I'm a businessman. Tommy, I'm here to collect a debt. Perhaps she's the payment." The insult, so casual and dehumanizing, was like a physical blow. It was the same crude appraisal the cowboys at the Crossroads had given her, but sharper, crueler, wielded like a weapon. She was a thing to be bartered, a piece of property. That was the moment the world exploded. Thomas moved faster than she could have imagined. He didn't shout or posture. He simply drew his Colt, the motion a blur of deadly efficiency, and fired. Not at Cole, but at the ground just in front of his feet. The dust kicked up in a violent spray. "Take one more step," Thomas said, his voice cold as a grave. "And the next one goes through your heart." Cole Maddox froze, his mocking smile finally vanishing. He stared at Thomas, a new respect dawning in his cold eyes. "There he is," he said softly, almost admiringly. "There's the man I remember." Then all hell broke loose. The other 4 men drew their guns, and the quiet homestead erupted into a deafening chaos of gunfire and shouting. Thomas dove for the cover of an old watering trough, firing back with a calm, deadly precision. One of the riders cried out and clutched his arm, his gun clattering to the ground. Mary Louise was frozen in a state of pure, primal terror. The sound of the gunshots was a physical assault, shaking the very walls of the cabin. This was real. This wasn't shooting at tin cans. This was the violence that had taken her husband, the violence that had haunted her nightmares. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to cower, to hide, to shrink into the corner and wait for it to be over. One way or another, the old Mary Louise, the victim, screamed at her to run. But then she heard a new sound, a sharp, guttural cry of pain that was not from one of the bandits. She peered through the crack in the wall and saw Thomas stumble. A dark red stain was spreading across his left shoulder. He staggered back against the trough, his face pale, his gun arm wavering. One of Cole's men, a big brutish man with a scar down his face, saw his chance. He spurred his horse forward, raising his pistol to take a final, careful aim at the wounded Thomas. In that instant, Mary Louise's world slowed down. The choice that had been an abstract, psychological battle became a stark, immediate reality. She could stay here, cowering behind the wall, and watch the man who had saved her, the man who had promised not to abandon her, be executed in the dirt. She could run out the back, flee into the prairie, and maybe, just maybe, save herself. That was the path of the victim, the path of the woman who waited for fate. Or she could fight. Wishing won't stop a man with bad intentions. A bullet will. Thomas's words, spoken with such brutal clarity weeks ago, echoed in her mind. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a truth written in gunpowder and blood right outside her door. A lifetime of choices converged on this single, terrifying point. The fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. But something else rose to meet it, a fierce, protective rage. They were not just threatening Thomas. They were threatening her home, her life, the future she had dared to imagine for herself. They were trying to drag her back to the Crossroads, to make her that helpless, waiting woman again. And she would not go. With a cry that was half sob, half war cry, she turned from the wall. Thomas's spare revolver was on the table where he'd been cleaning it earlier. Her hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled for it. It felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight. She remembered his instructions, a litany in the midst of the chaos. Both hands. Steady your grip. Aim. Squeeze. Don't pull. She unbarred the door and threw it open. She stood in the doorway, a small, determined figure silhouetted against the dark interior. The big man with the scar was just lining up his shot. The world seemed to shrink to just him. The end of his gun barrel, a black, malevolent eye. She raised the heavy revolver with both hands, just as Thomas had taught her. The gun shook, her arms trembling from the weight and the terror. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, then forced them open. She looked down the barrel, lined up the sight on the center of the man's broad chest, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil a brutal, bone-jarring shock that slammed through her arms and shoulders. She missed, but the shot was close enough. The bullet whizzed past the man's head with an angry buzz, and his horse reared in panic. His shot went wild, burying itself in the wooden wall of the barn. He fought to control his panicked mount, his face a mask of stunned fury as he stared at her, this slip of a woman who dared to fire at him. But her shot had done its job. It had bought Thomas a crucial second. Though wounded, he pushed himself up, his own gun steady again. He fired once. The man with the scar grunted, a red flower blooming on his chest, and he toppled from his saddle like a sack of grain. Cole Maddox stared, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rage, first at his fallen man, then at Mary Louise, who was still standing in the doorway, trembling. The heavy revolver clutched in her hands. He had dismissed her as a trinket, a weakness, but she was a fighter. The tide of the battle had turned. Another of his men, seeing his compatriot fall, lost his nerve. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, kicking up a plume of dust. Now it was just Cole and one other man against a wounded but still deadly Thomas, and a woman who had just proven she was not a victim. Cole Maddox was a businessman, not a fool. He knew when a debt had become too costly to collect. He gave Thomas one last look, a look that was a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. Then his venomous gaze fell on Mary Louise. "This isn't over, Tommy," he snarled. "I'll be back, and when I do, I'll collect what I'm owed." Starting with her, with a final, hateful glare. He spurred his black stallion, and he and his remaining man galloped away, disappearing over the rise, leaving a wake of dust and silence behind them. The sudden quiet was as shocking as the noise had been. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Mary Louise stood frozen in the doorway, the revolver still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Her ears were ringing. Her entire body was shaking with the aftershock of adrenaline and terror. She looked at the still form of the man she had shot at, lying in the dust. Then her gaze flew to Thomas. He was leaning heavily against the watering trough, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His left shoulder was soaked in blood. But he was alive, and he was looking at her. Not with pity, not with shock, but with an expression of profound, overwhelming pride. She finally let the heavy gun drop from her nerveless fingers. It landed in the dust with a soft thud. She had faced the ghosts of the past. They had come with guns and threats, and they had tried to destroy her. She had been terrified. She had trembled, but she had not run. She had stood her ground. She had fought back. The woman of the Crossroads was gone forever. The echo of the final gunshot faded, leaving a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the chaos it replaced. The acrid smell of burnt powder hung in the hot, still air. For a long moment, Mary Louise stood frozen in the doorway, the world a dizzying, unreal blur. Before her lay the grim tableau of their battle, a dead man sprawled in the dust, the ground littered with spent cartridges, and Thomas, the man she loved, slumped against the watering trough, his lifeblood staining the parched earth. The paralysis shattered as he groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony. The sight of his pain was a physical jolt to her system. cutting through the shock and flooding her with a fierce, adrenaline-fueled purpose. There was no time for fear. Fear was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. "Thomas!" She ran to his side, dropping to her knees in the dust. His face was ashen, his skin clammy with a cold sweat. The bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his left shoulder, a ragged, ugly wound that was bleeding profusely. "Inside!" he gasped, his voice a strained whisper. "Get me inside." He was a strong man, but weakened by blood loss. He was a dead weight. She looped his good arm over her shoulders, her small frame straining under his. "Lean on me," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "We have to move, now." Somehow, she got him to his feet. They staggered across the yard, a slow, painful journey of a few dozen feet that felt like miles. He gritted his teeth, his breath hissing in pain with every step. She ignored the body of the fallen outlaw. Her entire world narrowed to the single, all-important task of getting Thomas to safety. She guided him into the cabin and eased him onto his bedroll by the hearth. His head lolled back, his eyes closing. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought she had lost him, but then his chest rose in a shallow, ragged breath. She knew what she had to do. She had tended to Jacob when he'd cut his hand badly with an axe, had helped the town doctor with minor injuries. But this was different. This was a bullet wound. This was a matter of life and death. With a grim resolve, she took his knife from his belt. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and sliced through the fabric of his bloody shirt, cutting it away to expose the wound. It was worse than she'd thought. The bullet had gone clean through, but the flesh was torn and bleeding heavily. She raced to the stream, her bucket clutched in her hand, and ran back with clean, cold water. She tore strips from her cleanest spare petticoat to make bandages. Kneeling beside him, she began the grim work of cleaning the wound. He cried out when the water first touched the raw flesh, his body arching in pain. I know," she soothed, her voice a low murmur. Tears she refused to let fall burning at the back of her eyes. "Just hold on, Thomas, just hold on for me." As she worked, her hands sure and steady despite the tremor in her soul, a profound role reversal settled over them. This man who had been her unassailable protector was now utterly helpless. His strength, his formidable competence, had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, human vulnerability, and in his weakness, she found a new depth to her own strength. She was no longer the one being saved. She was the one doing the saving. She packed the wound on both sides and bound his shoulder tightly, using all her strength to pull the bandages taut and slow the bleeding. When she was done, his breathing was a little easier. She covered him with a blanket and sat back on her heels, exhausted, her dress stained with his blood. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. The beauty of it felt like a cruel joke. The body was still out there. She couldn't leave it for the coyotes. It felt wrong, a desecration that would taint the home they were trying to build. Steeling herself, she took a shovel from the barn and began to dig in the hard-packed earth a good distance from the cabin. It was grueling work. Every scrape of the shovel against the rocky soil was a reminder of the violence that had invaded their lives. When she was done, she dragged the body to the shallow grave. She did not look at his face. She took his gun and his ammunition, practicalities of survival overriding everything else. And then she filled the hole, packing the earth down until all that was left was a raw, ugly scar on the land. By the time she returned to the cabin, night had fallen, and Thomas was burning with fever. He was delirious, tossing on his bedroll, muttering names she didn't know alongside Cole's. He was trapped in the past, reliving old battles, old betrayals. She bathed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth, murmuring to him, trying to anchor him to the present, to her. "It's all right, Thomas," she whispered, her voice a constant, soothing presence in the dark. "You're safe. I'm here." For 2 days, she fought for his life. She forced broth and water between his parched lips. She kept the fire going, changing his bandages, cleaning the wound, and talking to him. Always talking. Telling him about her garden, about the sky, about the future she was determined they would have. She did not sleep. She was a fierce, vigilant guardian, and she would not let death have him. On the third day, the fever broke. He woke in the late afternoon, his eyes clear for the first time since the fight. He looked at her, truly seeing her, and the look in his eyes was one of raw, unguarded emotion. "Mary Louise," he rasped, his voice weak. "I'm here," she said, her own voice thick with relief. You saved me." "We saved each other," she corrected softly. They needed medicine, proper supplies. His wound, though clean, was a festering source of pain, and their food was running low. Promise Creek was the only option. Thomas was too weak to travel, which meant she would have to go alone. The thought terrified her, but she squared her shoulders. She was no longer afraid of that town. She rode in on Bess, Thomas's gentle mare, sitting tall in the saddle. As she moved down the main street, a strange thing happened. People stopped and stared, but the looks were different. The whispers that followed her were not of scorn, but of awe. The news of the shootout had traveled, as news always does in the West, growing wilder and more legendary with each telling. She walked into the general store, and the conversation died instantly. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, and when she saw Mary Louise, her mouth fell open. "I need laudanum, carbolic soap, and fresh bandages," Mary Louise said, her voice clear and strong. She placed a few of Thomas's silver coins on the counter, and a sack of potatoes. Mrs. Gable stared at her as if she were a ghost. The story they'd heard was that the Maddox gang had attacked the old homestead, and that the unlucky widow and her strange man had fought them off, killing one of them. No one had believed it. Not really. But looking at the young woman before her, her face pale and tired, but her eyes filled with a hard-won steel Mrs. Gable was beginning to— "Is it true?" she breathed, her usual sourness replaced by a stunned curiosity. "We defended our home," Mary Louise said simply. It was all the explanation she would give. The storekeeper filled her order with a new, fumbling respect. As she left, a man on the boardwalk tipped his hat to her. It was the first time any man in this town, other than Jacob, had ever shown her such a simple courtesy. They no longer saw the mad woman of the Crossroads, or the unlucky widow. They saw a woman who had faced down one of the most feared gangs in the territory and survived. They saw a woman who was strong. She returned to the cabin that evening to find Thomas sitting up, his back against the wall. He was still weak, but the light of life was back in his eyes. She tended to his wound with the new supplies, her touch gentle and sure. That night, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. The threat of Cole's return was a distant thunder on the horizon, but for now, the storm had passed. They had survived. She lay on her bedroll beside him. He was weak, in pain, his body a map of old scars and new wounds. But she had never felt safer. In his vulnerability, he had become wholly hers, and in caring for him, she had become wholly her own person. He reached out his good hand and took hers. His grip was weak, but his fingers intertwined with hers, a silent, binding promise. "Mary Louise," he said, his voice a low murmur in the firelight. "Everything I was, everything I did, it was all just a way of surviving, alone." He turned his head to look at her, his eyes dark with the memories of 1,000 lonely nights. "I didn't know what it was to live for something, for someone, until you—" His confession, so simple and raw, undid her. The last of her own defenses crumbled. This was not a bandit, not a killer. This was a man who had been lost in the dark for so long that he had forgotten the warmth of the sun. She leaned over and kissed him. It was a kiss altogether different from their first one at the Crossroads. That had been a kiss of choice, of promise. This was a kiss of deep, soul-shattering intimacy. It was a kiss of homecoming. In the flickering light of the hearth, they came together. It was not a frantic, passionate claiming, but a slow, reverent exploration. It was a silent vow made not with words, but with the quiet language of touch in his weakness. She found the strength to give herself to him completely, and in her gentle care, he found the strength to be vulnerable, to let her see the man behind the scars. Every touch was a prayer, an erasing of past pains. For him, it was an absolution, a washing away of the blood and grit of his past in the clean, healing waters of her love. For her, it was the final, definitive warming of a soul that had been left to shiver in the cold for far too long. They were two broken halves of a single soul, finding their wholeness in the sanctuary of each other's arms. Later, as they lay tangled together under a shared blanket, the fire dying to embers, she traced the line of the new, angry scar on his shoulder. It was a brutal mark, a permanent reminder of the violence they had endured. But it was not a symbol of defeat. It was a testament. This scar, and the memory of her own 7 cold nights at the Crossroads, were their shared history. They were the proof of the darkness they had walked through, the evidence of the battles they had won. They were the ugly, beautiful, indelible marks of their survival. And now, they would be the foundation of the life they would build together, a life no longer defined by the shadows they had escaped, but by the light they had found in each other. The weeks after the fever broke were a time of quiet mending. The homestead, once a temporary refuge, began to feel like a permanent anchor. The raw scar in the earth where Mary Louise had buried the outlaw slowly faded, overgrown by the stubborn prairie grass. But the memory of the violence remained, a ghost that walked the grounds in the heat of noon and the chill of midnight. It had marked them, changed them. The silence that fell between them now was not one of distance or uncertainty, but of a deep, shared understanding. They had faced death together, and in doing so, had forged a bond stronger than steel. Thomas healed slowly. His shoulder was a constant, throbbing source of pain, a stark reminder of his vulnerability. For a man who had relied on his physical strength and quick reflexes his entire life, the weakness was a difficult burden. He was forced to depend on Mary Louise for everything, from changing his bandages to cutting his food. But in this enforced dependency, something new grew between them. He learned the grace of acceptance, and she, the power of her own gentle strength. She would read to him in the evenings from the single book of poetry she'd salvaged from her old life, her voice a soft melody against the crackle of the fire, and he would watch her, his gaze filled with a quiet reverence that made her feel more beautiful than she ever had before. As he regained his strength, they began to build. They worked not with the frantic energy of survivors, but with the steady, deliberate rhythm of founders. They were not just repairing a shelter, they were creating a home. Thomas, with his good arm, taught her how to reinforce the walls of the crumbling barn, how to read the clouds for rain, how to track a deer. Mary Louise, in turn, brought life to their small patch of land. Her garden, once a pathetic little plot, began to flourish under her tender care. She found wild onions by the creek and transplanted them, planted seeds she'd bought in town, and soon they had a small, precious patch of green in the vast ocean of brown prairie. It was hard, relentless work, but it was honest work. Every repaired fence post, every weed pulled, every meal they shared was a small act of defiance against the chaos that had tried to consume them. They were laying down roots in a place that had only ever known endings. But the shadow of Cole Maddox was a constant, unspoken presence. It lingered at the edge of their peaceful days, a promise of future violence. Every distant dust cloud on the horizon was a question mark. Every snap of a twig in the night, a potential answer. They never spoke his name, but his threat was woven into the fabric of their new life. It was in the way Thomas always sat with his back to a wall, his Colt now a permanent fixture on his hip, even inside the cabin. It was in the way Mary Louise practiced her shooting every single day, her aim becoming steady and true, the tin cans dancing on the log one after another. She was no longer afraid of the gun. She respected it, understood it for what it was, a tool, a terrible necessity, the final argument in a land that rarely listened to reason. They knew he would be back. Cole was not a man to forget a slight or forgive a betrayal. They were living on borrowed time, but they were not waiting for the end. They were living, truly living, in the time they had been given. They found joy in the small, simple moments, the taste of the first radish from her garden, the sight of a hawk circling in the clear blue sky, the shared warmth of a blanket as they watched the stars emerge in the velvet darkness. Their love, born in violence and fear, had blossomed into something quiet, strong, and deeply resilient. It was a love that didn't need grand declarations or flowery promises. It was present in every shared glance, every silent act of care, every moment they stood together against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the world. About a month after the shootout, their supplies were once again running low. The trip to Promise Creek was a necessity. This time, Thomas was strong enough to go with her. As he hitched the Belgians to the wagon, he looked at her, his expression serious. "There's somewhere we need to go first," he said. She knew, even before he said the words, the Crossroads. The ride was different this time. They sat close on the wagon seat, her hand resting on his knee. The land around them no longer seemed menacing or empty. It was their land, their home. When they arrived at the intersection, it looked smaller, less significant than it was in her memory. The skeletal cottonwood tree seemed less like a clawing hand and more like an old, tired sentinel. Thomas pulled the horses to a stop. He didn't say anything, just sat there, allowing the weight of the place to settle. This was where her old life had ended in a haze of grief and despair. This was where his life of running had been interrupted by a choice. This was the place where their two desperate, lonely paths had converged. She thought of the woman who had sat here for 7 days and 7 nights, a ghost waiting for her own burial. She had been so certain that her story was over. She had prayed for an ending. And instead, life had sent her a beginning in the form of this complicated, dangerous, honorable man. The past was not gone. It was part of them. It was in the ugly, puckered scar on his shoulder and the calluses on her hands. It was in the memory of Jacob's kind laugh and in the wanted poster she had burned but could never truly forget. Love hadn't erased any of it. It hadn't washed them clean or made them new. It had simply given them the strength to carry the weight of their past without being crushed by it. It had given them the courage to stand firm, to face the future, whatever it might hold. She looked at the western road, the path Cole Maddox had taken, the path he would one day travel back on. The thought no longer filled her with a paralyzing terror. It filled her with a grim, steady resolve. Let him come. They would be ready. They were no longer two broken people waiting for fate to strike. They were a family. They were a fortress. She turned her gaze from the intersecting paths of dirt and dust and looked at the man beside her. He was her path now, her direction, her choice. He met her gaze, his slate-gray eyes filled with a love so deep and certain it was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. She leaned her head on his good shoulder, the one that didn't bear the mark of their battle, and a soft, genuine smile touched her lips. She thought of all the nights she had shivered here, praying for a sign, for any wagon to stop. And in a voice that was no longer a reedy whisper, but the clear, steady voice of a woman who knew her own heart, she spoke the words that were her final, definitive choice. I waited 7 nights in the wind and sand, and that wagon stopped just for me, she said softly, her words almost carried away by the same wind that had once been her only companion. From now on, I will wait no longer. I will go with you. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, let us know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give this story an extra boost, hit the hype button to help it be heard by more people.